the final of our parallel sessions, the Wardens Remember. So everyone here on stage is a warden or sometime warden, and it's my pleasure to introduce people who, of course, need no introduction. But first, Professor Haroon Ahmed, who's a Life Fellow, Honorary Fellow, and former Master of this college. Haroon obtained his PhD in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge, where he became a reader and subsequently moved to the Cavendish Laboratory, where he was appointed Professor of Microelectronics. Haroon was first elected to the fellowship in 1967. He supervised undergraduates for almost 20 years, served as Warden of Leckhampton, and after 30 years as a Fellow was elected Master. Professor Christopher Howe is a Fellow and currently the President of Corpus. He's Professor of Plant and Microbial Biochemistry. His research interests include biochemistry of photosynthesis and the evolution of photosynthetic and formerly photosynthetic organisms. He directs studies in preclinical medicine in the college, teaches biochemistry to first-year medical students, and was, of course, a former warden of Leckhampton. And then Professor David Ibbetson, again, former fellow of Corpus, the Regius Professor of Civil Law at this university. He gained his MA and PhD at Corpus and went on to become a fellow and a tutor at Magdalen College, Oxford. David returned to Corpus as a fellow in 2000, serving as warden of Leckhampton from 2004 to 13. And David also served as the 8th president of Clare Hall until very recently in 2019, our neighbors just down the street. I've introduced myself a few times over the weekend, so I won't bother. But basically, this is the least planned and the most organic of the sessions. But we're going to go in order, and it's just basically, it is what it says on the tin. The wardens will remember a variety of things. We're going to go in order in which these wardens served their time here at Leckhampton, so to speak. And so that means we're going to begin with Haroon and then proceed to Chris and then to David. And I'm just going to sort of be along for the ride and do some emceeing. So first, so Haroon Ahmed.
So, thank you, Warden. I should start on my 40 minutes. I became warden a long time ago. Let me try and remember then. 1993. But long before I became warden, I knew Leckhampton because when I arrived to do a PhD in the engineering department, there were 3 very lively Canadian students there, Peter Barnard, John Earnshaw, and Brian Gregory. Anybody know any of them? No. Anyway, they were very lively. There was just the main building, not the George Thompson building, certainly not the Coe building, and there was just the main building, so everybody lived there, and we had fabulous parties. And they invited me, although I was a Kingsman, I was here often with Longwood Higgins as warden. So that was how I got to know, and they were instrumental in digging the pool. They helped with the digging of the pool and the construction of some of the gardens in Leckhampton. Very lively group. Anyway, that was my introduction to Leckhampton. So that made me think Corpus might be a good college to come to because it's got a very good graduate place to work in. One of the delights was to welcome all the research students as they came in every new year, but we also had visiting fellows. And I'm going to tell you a story about visiting fellows. So we had Robin Coombs we had a visiting fellow from America, and he was accompanied by his wife, who was very pregnant. Has anybody been pregnant? Yes. There you are. One volunteer. My wife has been pregnant, as far as I remember. Anyway, part of pregnancy is to acquire quite a large bump here in the middle here. And there was this rather pregnant lady who'd come as the wife of one of the visiting fellows. And she stood there, and this rather elderly, harmless-looking, rather dull-looking, rather stupid-looking man came up to her to say hello. And she said, "Oh, hello." And he then pointed to her and said, "Oh, you're pregnant. Good, good, good." She said, "Yes, I'm pregnant, and I've had the Coombs test. Now, do you know what the Coombs test is?" And he said, "Oh, Coombs test." And she said, "Well, let me explain to you. Is these antibodies to be attached to a red blood cell? Do you know what a cell is? Do you know what antibodies are?" And he sort of was overawed, so he said nothing. So she explained this at length. And all this was going on, and I was standing there looking more and more embarrassed when her husband came back with the drinks. And he said, "Oh, darling, you have met Professor Coombs after all." So Professor Coombs was our warden, and he was such a modest man. Despite all his distinction, he didn't let on that he knew all about it. I was approached by Michael McCrum, who was master. I was terrified of him. And he said to me, "Now look here, you've done nothing for the college for a long time. You've just been doing your university career. Time you did something for the college. Do you want to be president?" "No, no, 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 I can't be president. I don't know how to write a menu or anything like that. So, no, 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 not me. But what would you like to be?" I said, "Well, I'd like to be warden of Leckhampton." So I got the job. I arrived here and looked around, said, "Oh, this is a good place." And then I realized that what was happening in the morning, I used to see droves of students getting on their bikes and or walking away, disappearing from Leckhampton. Oh, I said, no wonder where they went. Of course, they were going to their labs, where I should have been also. But they all disappeared. And then we saw solitary people wandering around. And I said, "Who are these?" And they were, of course, doing arts degrees. Well, they have no labs to go to. I'm glad you agree with me. They had no lab. They had no labs to go with, so they were wandering around being rather lonely. So I said, we must rectify that. So we had a meeting. At least I was told I had to come to a meeting. I went to a meeting and they said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" So I said, "Well, look, why don't we, oh, no, arrange for you to go to lots of lectures, like the Stephen Hales lecture?" "No, no, that's not so boring. It's only the fuzzy old fellows giving it. We should have students talking." So I said, "I give in to that suggestion. We'll have students talking. So let's create a society." So the Leckhampton Society was formed. Now, it was strictly for the art students. They were going to speak to other art students, and I was the only scientist allowed to attend, which I thought was quite a fine position to be in. And so this went on. This was started. And then I got this letter, acrimonious letter, saying a delegation wishes to meet you, Warden, to seek your urgent dismissal from this post. And along came a delegation. "We are all scientists," they say, "and we want to be in the Leckhampton Society." So that's how scientists and arts people got together and Leckhampton Society was formed. But obviously, societies don't do anything unless they have money. So in the end, a large donation from the warden created the Leckhampton Society, which I hope many of you who are students here still enjoy. So that's how the Leckhampton Society came into being. Now, I'm going to now say that one of the interesting features I had when we came here is that the warden's wife baked a cake, which was served on Sundays for a cake and tea party. Some of you are nodding, so you remember that. So there was a tea party in that room, which is used as a television room now, and the warden's wife baked the cake. Now, then came the time of the working wife. The working wife put her hand up and said, I'm not baking no cake. So the college found a little money, and the cakes were purchased from Fitzbilly's. So that's how the Fitzbilly's came. The cakes came there. They were very popular also. Not good as the warden's wife's cakes, but they were pretty good. And so we had cakes and the tea party there. And that used to be quite a custom, and now it's gone now, but it used to be in those days. So now I'm, of course, married, so I have to listen to the other half. And the other half said she would like to say a few words. And with the permission of JD, the other half might say a few words. So the other half is Anne. Is the clap for me or for her?
That applause is for Anne. Your applause is coming later.
Okay. I'm not as witty as speaker as my husband, I'm afraid, but he did not do it on his own. We did a lot of invitations to all the students who hadn't been used to having lots of invitations, and once or twice I had to go and knock on their doors and say, are you coming? And what is RSVP? Anyway, we eventually had a lot of students in once a week in the evening, and we had Trivial Pursuits parties, which were tremendous fun. And so we got to know so many students, and it was just such a great time. I really enjoyed looking after the research students. I can have this back.
Thank you, Anne.
So thank you very much, Anne, for giving me a break. And as far as the Trivial Pursuits parties go, so what happened was that after we had had about half a dozen Trivial Pursuits parties, word got around that the warden is a very intelligent man. Why? He seems to know all the answers to the Trivial Pursuits question. I had got so much practice that I didn't know it. Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Haroon. And now the unenviable task of having to follow in Haroon's footsteps. But Chris is going to remember something, I think, of his time strutting the boards here at Leckhampton, maybe among other things.
Well, yes, thank you, Haroon. I had various things I was going to reminisce about. One was the Leckhampton Society. Thank you. Another was Sunday teas at Leckhampton. And another one was a story about Robin Coons. So I can that's fine. You find out who your friends are. I can add to the Robin Coons story, because he actually invented the Coons test when he was very young.
Yes.
And he used to delight in describing the number of times he'd been at conferences when he'd introduced himself to people, and they clearly said, oh, but I thought, and then were obviously going to say, I thought you died a long time ago, and then they dig themselves out of that hole. But he was a lovely man. He was a lovely man, and his wife Anne as well. And the Sunday teas were very good. In my day, when I took over as warden, the cakes were provided by the kitchens. I think the budget for Fitzbilly's had run out. And John Burton used to. Does anybody here remembers John Burton? He's now in Oxford. He used to relish wheeling the trolley round for the Sunday afternoon teas. I think a career in British Airways would have been an alternative for him if he'd wanted to do that. But yeah, so the Leckhampton plays, which JD mentioned, I can see at least one other person in the audience I know who's been in the Leckhampton play. If I say to you, Bellows, he's going to respond. He's forgotten his lines now, so you've forgotten your lines. Was anybody else in the Leckhampton play? Excellent. Oh, it was quite a good number, actually. So we could maybe invite people to comment on their reminiscence. I will give one reminiscence of Leckhampton play, well, one or two, which involves my nude scene. and which was a production of She Stoops to Conquer, and it involved me in the bath at the opening of the play, and I was actually allowed something on by way of modesty. And Anne McBurney was my wife in the play, who was busy mopping my back in the bath. And I remember two things particularly, well, three things actually. One, Leckhampton veranda, even on a summer evening, in the middle of the night, if you're wearing no clothes, is extremely cold. Number two, I remember it's a bit like now, the lights kind of shining down on you, so I couldn't see anybody in the audience, but I could just hear one of my PhD students who was sitting in the front row, who was laughing continually throughout my new scene. So that was quite memorable. And we had Oliver Rackham was a great partaker of the Leckhampton plays, and the whole thing was a wonderful experience, and it really, as I'm sure you remember, brought the whole Leckhampton community together, and everybody did things. And I remember Oliver, who lived in Leckhampton House at the time, deciding to darn his socks while waiting to go on stage, because there was quite a long gap before he went on stage. And whereas you or I would have, got a bag of cotton and scissors and things, Oliver happened to have a medieval battle axe in his room. So he brought his medieval battle axe down for cutting the cottons. But unfortunately, halfway through, and it was at a quiet moment in the play itself, he dropped his battle axe, and there was this tremendous crashing sound from behind the scenes, which was Oliver's battle axe, and all the audience were trying to work out what was this strange noise behind the scenes. But I don't know if anybody else wants to add any of their reminiscences on Leckhampton plays. Anyone? Or maybe if people are unwilling now, we can get people to comment on them later.
I can add something, yeah. Warden, if you allow me to. All I can remember is that I auditioned for one. Oh. And I auditioned for the Leckhampton play to have a significant part in it, but the committee said, no, please could you do the lights?
I think they were less discerning in my day. So.
They just want to be upstage.
Well, yes, we have a volunteer there.
They weren't always fun, the Leckhampton plays. I remember some of us were in Coriolanus, and it was quite an individual interpretation by my contemporary John Bintliff. And certainly Anne McBurney took great issue with the interpretation that was being put over by John, and she was vindicated by the letters of complaint, particularly from one schoolmistress who had brought a party to Leckhampton for the occasion. They were not enlightened days. This would have been 74 most probably, 72 or 74. But we all had a good time. The other person to mention in this context, though, is Richard Bainbridge.
Indeed, yeah.
Richard, of course, took, like Oliver, was a very keen participant in these plays. It was quite disconcerting playing with him because he'd never learnt all his lines, but he could always make up plenty of pseudo-Shakespearean lines. But of course, if you were waiting for your cue, it never came. Quite how these weren't total disasters, perhaps remains to be answered.
I know exactly what you mean, because I've had exactly the same experience. The very first Leckhampton play I was in, Richard was in as well. And yes, waiting for your cues was an interesting experience. There was the occasion when apparently there was a group of school children who were following the play from, it was a Shakespeare play, and they're following it from the book. And Richard had to make an entrance through the audience. And as he was going through the audience, one of the school children held out the book and said, "Here, mate, this might help." but Richard was an amazing contributor to those plays, so thank you for mentioning Richard. And on that note, I think I've said enough, and I shall hand over to David. Thank you.
I shall be much more prosaic. Much of my time as warden was spent in the bursar's office, persuading him actually to spend money on Leckhampton. And I think I did it fairly successfully. We got the co-building out of that. And it was the devil's own job sometimes to persuade the then bursar to open his purse, because graduate students were not the sort of thing we needed to spend money on, even though they were much more valuable than the undergraduates for these purposes. So there was a great deal of rather tedious administration, and I'm not going to go into that anymore because it is actually really quite boring. The people who were here, and I was, I think, the last warden who knew the people who had effectively set up Leckhampton. Peter Lewis, David Dewhurst. David had been warden, Peter had been a very, very long-standing member of the Leckhampton community. And it was wonderful just to be taken back in their history to what it was like to be in the excitement of setting up a graduate community. And that was the thing which really sticks in my mind. And the other person, of course, was Oliver. Oliver, who everybody knew, everybody remembered. And much of my time was spent trying to calm Oliver down when he was disapproving of what it was we were doing. He disapproved of the co-building, its existence, he disapproved of its design. He disapproved of absolutely everything that was done in the garden and opposed it as strongly as he could do. And much of the time was spent just sort of gently patting him and saying, "It's all right, Oliver, we're not going to do anything very wicked." But he was an extremely good friend. But then there were the events that happened in Leckhampton. I don't think we had a play in my time. What we did have was the Leckhampton pantomime. Now, if Coriolanus was bad, rest assured a pantomime was bad. And these pantomimes, I don't know if they still go on. These pantomimes clearly, or at first, obliged me to be dragged up in them, because obviously cross-dressing is quite normal. When Stuart Lane became president, he took over the role of dragging up, and I had to do even more demeaning things. So I think in one I had to appear as a cow. With Oliver going moo, moo, moo for days afterwards. So on one occasion, after pantomime, probably after the first one we did, I got a letter of a complaint from a visiting fellow who was a Baptist minister from the United States, who was not acquainted with the whole cultural milieu of the pantomime. So that was one of our less obscene ones. So after that, I would always send round an email to all those who were attending, explaining that pantomimes might perhaps involve double entendres. They might even involve a degree of cross-dressing. I didn't dare say that they would involve the master doing the cross-dressing as well. That was one step beyond what I could decently do. But those were very much the high spot. But also the way the Christmas carol service here worked. I remember one occasion, the house was full. Very full. It was very hot. It would always end with Oliver reading a ghost story or reciting a ghost story more normally. And I just came out into the garden just for a bit of fresh air and looked back at the house, and it could have been a Victorian event. It was wonderfully atmospheric. You could see the Christmas tree with the lights on it and people there sipping their mulled wines. It was really very, very beautiful. And then I have a memory of what wasn't. I'd been a student here. I think I was the first warden who had actually been a student at Leckhampton. And the great thing about Leckhampton when I was here in the 1970s was the Leckhampton breakfast. Breakfast 5 days a week. Absolutely splendid meal. Absolutely splendid meal. But it wasn't merely that the meal was splendid, it was also the man who was doing the cooking for them, I guess. OJ. OJ wrote novels, but his profession was bank robber. And he spent quite a lot of time inside. And he gave the most spectacular Stephen Hales talk on how to rob a bank. I'd forgotten something that he'd said then, which was about the design of safe, which was the easiest to blow. So when it came in the early 2000s to be designing what's now the Taylor Library, taking over from the NatWest Bank, I hadn't clocked that I knew the design of the safe in the vault, as OJ had explained to us how to blow it up. We never did, of course. So the one thing that I missed when I was here as warden was those spectacular breakfasts, which had a great effect pulling the whole community together. For someone who had been spending 25 years of his life basically teaching undergraduates and with my own PhD students, but then to move into a graduate community, just mixing with graduate students doing a whole range of different subjects. It was an enormous eye-opener and a complete privilege, and I absolutely loved it. So, thank you.
So we now know that we invented the content warning here in relationship to the panto, ahead of the curve as always. Are there any other, I just wanted to open it up to other reminiscences or questions or anything else that any of us might want to say. Yeah.
I arrived in, thanks. I arrived here in 1982, which any historian of the college will know is a significant year. It was the admission of the first female students in the college after 400, whatever it was, years. And I'd been round the block. I'd been living in South America and I was a man of the world. And I remember there was a lot of very anxious conversations amongst some of the fellows at the time. And it was regarded as a radical departure for the college. And I think the idea was to start off with just having a small cohort of half a dozen graduate students, and then of course it became open later. But if some of the senior guys could explain to us some of the debates that were happening at the time and the wisdom of opening the college up to female students.
Thank you. As a female student, yeah, that's an excellent question.
Oh yes, I do remember those debates. There were some contentious issues. One of them was, we'll have to build some more loos because we'll have to find separate loos. Now the loos here are unisex now, but they used to be very separated. So there was one worry about that. We were not the earliest. We were among the last of the colleges. Modern were much later to admit women. The issues became contentious because several fellows had got used to the idea of having male only, and they dined in college, they lived in college, and they didn't want to sort of change the society. And it sort of remained like that. And it remained for hundreds of years, 600 actually, before these changes took place. But society changes, and King's, Churchill, and several other colleges had admitted women, so eventually college followed suit. But the arguments were rather fierce in the governing body. I'll only tell you the funny one about the loos.
I arrived in Corpus in '83, so I wasn't party to any of those discussions. But one of the things that I remember particularly was, as I came as a research fellow, people were explaining the arrangements for dining at high table, and fellows were not encouraged to bring their wives to dinner. And it was explained to me, of course, Saturday evenings at high table are often wife-swapping evenings. And okay, fine, whatever. And the arrangement, which actually seemed very practical, there was nothing to stop people bringing somebody else's wife to high table. So fellows would have little, you probably,
Yes, I remember that.
they would bring another fellow's wife, and the other fellow would bring their wife, and so it all worked out very well. So it just goes to show the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath.
I just wanted to say that I was one of the first women ever to sit on high table, because they first of all had academic colleagues. So I think I dined on high table in 1968.
No, you couldn't have. Before I was a fellow, you couldn't have
You
done.
were a fellow in 67, and
Oh,
before we were
sorry.
married.
Sorry.
So 1968, and I remember Oliver eating grapes with a knife and fork and picking out all the seeds. So, and it was quite a revelation for me, because everybody ate so rapidly. They didn't eat very socially. I couldn't keep up with them. So, it's big change happened.
I shouldn't really speak about it, but I was a student at the time that all the debates were going on about the college being mixed. And one of the things with hindsight, which was so interesting, was that the student body was very divided about it as well. That I think probably the majority of the students here were very happy if the college had stayed single-sexed. Now, that wouldn't have survived, I think, after other colleges had started going in substantial numbers. When I moved to Oxford, to a mixed college, it was just so normal to be at a mixed college. Clearly it worked. But I was very surprised in the mid-70s just how much opposition there was from the student body for all sorts of different reasons, which we will not go into.
I'll just say that I was one of those first 4 girls that arrived in 1982. I mean, it's not surprising they'd chosen to go to a male college, and then suddenly they found out that there were going to be women there. So I'm not surprised that some of them were opposed to it. But I mean, I always felt very welcome here in the community and had a fantastic 3 years here. And it's great to catch up with a few people here tonight, this weekend. And I've got some photos here, and I just looking to see who was on the committee. We had a ball here, which I remember very well, in 1982. And I was on the committee along with Robin Draper, Cleve Forty, Jane Hewitt, Henry Mallory, Mia Fernando, Roger Forty, Will Leith, famous Leith, Bruce Stein, in case anybody remembers those names. And there's the programme. It was called the Careless Talk Cost Lives Ball, and it had a wartime theme. And that was brilliant fun organising that. Many other happy memories, and I hope to talk to other people this evening about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
On the topic of females at Leckhampton, when I arrived in the mid-90s, the issue hadn't quite been settled yet either. And we had these wonderful wine and silver nights. Do they still happen? So there was, I mean, the dining hall was tiny still in those days. Could you fit 20, 25 around it? Remind me, it's so long ago. Not many. It was a small affair. But when I was fairly new to Leckhampton, and I didn't quite know about the story that women at Leckhampton was quite a novel thing, I got to sit next to Professor Coombs. Delightful. As the conversation wore on, and he had ascertained that I was not a fellow's wife. Oh, and I was not an art student either. The conversation abruptly ended with a very polite, I wonder whether it last rained. And I knew he wasn't going to talk to a female scientist.
I would actually dispute that. You know, my husband was master, and so I've met a lot of undergraduates. Even now, when I come to Leckhampton, everybody asks me, what do I do? What was my work? What was my research? They're not interested in, you know, trivialities. They talk to me as though I'm a human being and not an idiot. So I think that being a fellow's wife doesn't necessarily put you in that category, but Leckhampton has always been just like that, very welcoming and not at all judgmental about people.
If there really is nobody else. Really? No. Sorry, this is a very trivial thing, but if it's not presumptuous of me to say, my little contribution, indirect contribution to Leckhampton life consists in a notice, or altering a notice, or putting notice. If you go to the swimming pool, you will find a notice saying that this swimming pool is reserved for members of Leckhampton House and their guests in their company. Now, the words "in their company" used to be underlined. And I was indirectly responsible for that, because on one occasion I'd been working in the university library, and I came back walking down Leckhampton Drive, and I was met by a party of students from Trinity College, where my younger brother at the time happened to be an undergraduate. And when they saw me, it was a glorious summer day, they roared with laughter and said, "Hello, Andrew, we've just been your guests at the swimming pool." And of course, I knew nothing about this. And what had happened was that they had been disporting themselves at the swimming pool. David Dewhurst had naturally come up to them and had quite reasonably asked them what they were doing. And they had all roared with laughter and had said, "We are Andrew Lennox Cunningham's guests." Well, David could see quite clearly I was nowhere to be seen around there. So that was why the notice was put up, saying only to guests in their company, which was then underlined. So that's my very small contribution to the history of Leckhampton.
I can, although the pool hasn't been open for a while, but I can attest to the fact that wardening involves part-time lifeguarding of a sort. But in any case, well, I think we're close to the end of the session. So thank you so much. I mean, I think it's interesting and important to hear actually differing accounts of what subjective experience was like to be here at various points in time. So thank you all. First of all, thank my examples of wardening, to whom I'm all very grateful, and thank all of you for being here and for also contributing these wonderful anecdotes. And I think we now have a bit of a pause. Is that right? Is Rachel still here? Until I just need to look at the time. Until 6 o'clock, when we'll be joined by the master, the senior tutor, and the tutor for admissions to talk about the future of Leckhampton. So again, thank you all, wardens. And thank you.